as the director of the Regenhard Center. Glenn has been on our advisory board and was really the founder. We'd just like to welcome you for those who aren't on our regular list of attendees. But we do hold monthly seminars, now online, on various topics related to emergency management, emergency response to large-scale events. And you can join our listserv. And also we have a Twitter feed. We're at RaCERS JJC. And so we encourage you to follow us, and I'm sure there'll be an event that will be of interest to a diverse audience. So thank you for being here today. And thank you, Sandy.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Yes, and the Regenhard Center resides at John Jay College in New York City. We're a particular college within the City University of New York, with a specific focus on public safety. So we have programs in fire science, emergency management, forensic science, forensic psychology, a whole wide range of programs that deal with, again, the general issue of public safety. The center itself, as Charles mentioned, was formed several years ago. It is named after Christian Regenhard, who was a probationary firefighter on 9/11, who was killed that day. And we've named the center after him as a legacy, really, for that young man who had so much potential and unfortunately was murdered that day back in September 2001. So we honor him through the center is named after him. And so we've tried to strive to provide really up-to-date, sort of cutting-edge information on a variety of topics, dealing everything from active shooter situations to earthquakes to today's presentation, which is talking about the issues revolving around Katrina. And we're very thankful to have Sandy with us, but I do need to do one more thank you, and that's for the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution, which is actually one of our sister centers at John Jay College, and they're helping us today with the Zoom session, actually putting it together for us so we have the platform. And specifically, we want to thank Michelle Mason. She's the one who made all this happen today. So thanks to them as well. So Sandy, as I right up front, I need to disclose something that you and I have known each other for several years now, and I do actually sit on your advisory board. So as a moment of disclosure, I need to note that going forward that I do sit on Sandy's advisory board for Levees.org. So Sandy, again, thank you for being with us today. We all know, I think you're in the eye of a hurricane again, certainly in a weird way, a way of starting off our conversation today. I just want to sort of set the groundwork here. I've got a few questions for you about sort of the beginning of all this and what have you. And I would just sort of summarize what you said in your book about how this whole, how you ended up with us today, basically, really. How did all this start? And correct me if I'm wrong on any of these issues, but basically, you're a New Englander. You grew up in New England. You moved to New Orleans many years ago with your husband and your children. You live as to this day in New Orleans, and you had a lot of, you were a person that was very focused on proper preparation for hurricanes, which are, of course, doing business in New Orleans, and so much so that you and your husband, you work with him in his business dealing with issues of workman's comp, that when you saw Hurricane Katrina sort of heading for New Orleans, you already had a plan in place. So you knew that you wanted to sort of evacuate and not only move yourselves, but move his work up to Baton Rouge. So that sort of sets the stage for us. So you were a person that was well prepared, really, to think about a hurricane. You're ready, and you moved when it was appropriate, and you found yourself up at Baton Rouge. So you want to tell us just briefly what happened over the next few weeks, particularly about the sort of this bubble of TV that you were in for weeks, watching this over and over again, right? So you want to tell us about that, Sandy?
I think you've raised a really good point that I wouldn't even really understand until years later. If it weren't for my preparation, my family's preparation, the organization levees.org would never have been created. It was a situation where, because we were so well prepared, because we had our list, because we packed for 3 weeks, because we boarded up the house before we left, because of all of those things, that preparation put me and my family in a relatively secure space. It wasn't comfortable and nice, but it was relatively secure, so that from that vantage point, we could watch the disaster unfold, and then, just as critical, is watch the response unfold. And so from this vantage point, we could watch and observe without the trauma of not having anything with us. Most people, and I take that back, everybody who evacuated that I've interviewed, and it's hundreds of people, packed for 1 to 2 days. They thought that they would be back in 1 to 2 days. Studies have been written about that phenomenon. Books have been written about that phenomenon. What is it about people that thinks they'll be gone for 1 to 2 days? It's a Cat 5 heading straight toward us. But aside from all that, but you raise a very, very good point about the preparation putting me and my family in a very unusual space. Mm-hmm.
Right, and you were immersed in television there, right? So
yes. So
you bring it out clearly, right?
Because of that, being in that secure, it's really it's not only a physical state but a mental state as well. I had my own version of post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is subject of another time, but I was able to channel that into working because of the preparation. So because we were prepared, because we, and also because I didn't flood, my house didn't flood, my husband's business didn't flood, I spent literally every waking minute channeling my post-traumatic stress syndrome into studying the disaster, reading everything I could find, listening to the radio every minute I could that I was in the car, watching the news. And it was because of that ability to focus that put me in an unusual space that I came to my own version, my own conclusion about the version of events, and then almost immediately had pushback from the government.
Right, and so that's what I want to focus on right now. Is it seems to me you have indicated in your book, Whispers in the Water, which, by the way, here's the book. We're going to talk about it later where you can get it. And we will have Q&A at the end of our discussion here. We can talk about any questions folks may have that are on the Zoom session with us today. It seems to me there were two pivotal things that happened that sort of set you on the path to creating Levees. The first one was your reading of Anu Mittal's GAO report. That specific thing seemed to be a big motivator to you because you read things that you didn't believe, basically. And of course, that other pivot, really perhaps was the pivotal moment, was in a tennis session with a male partner. You're a tennis expert. You're you love tennis and things, and you were playing a game, and that game that you played with that other partner seems to me was like the spark that sort of set you in motion. And so you want to talk about the GAO report. You want to talk about that experience with the tennis player, because both of those things sort of focus you on, hey, this isn't, I think, the story that really is really truthful, right? So you want to talk about those two things?
Certainly. The government accountability report submitted by Anu Mittal was just 4 weeks after the flood. And in very plain English, her report stated that the Army Corps of Engineers is responsible for design and construction of the levees, and that the locals maintain completed structures. Well, I'm not a civil engineer or an attorney, but it certainly looked to me that if, like, let's say it's a building fell to the ground, you wouldn't blame the janitor, you'd blame the architect and the designer and the contractor. And in the case of the levees in New Orleans, the Army Corps of Engineers is all three of those things. So that, to me, was the big light bulb, that all of the things I was hearing, blaming us, blaming the people for, blaming us for living here, blaming the sandy soil, blaming the storm. By the way, the winds of Katrina didn't get higher than 69 miles an hour in New Orleans. Okay.
Right.
So, but without focusing on all that, all of a sudden I realized that the Army Corps of Engineers was blaming anything but itself when it was they who were responsible. About 3 weeks later, very shortly after that, that is the situation where I found myself on a tennis court with a tennis partner from the middle of Louisiana, about 3 hours away from New Orleans, who told me that I didn't deserve help for living in New Orleans because it's a city below sea level, and that Katrina was a huge storm and I shouldn't have been living there. And that was the other big pivotal moment, because I call this gentleman, whose name I don't know, I call him wearing the face of the monster that the Army Corps of Engineers had created with their mischaracterization and their disinformation campaign that they were waging to shift blame away from itself. So those two events happened pretty close together, and I would agree that's actually a pretty good assessment, Professor. Those two were the pivotal events.
Right, and so that set you in motion to actually create Levees.org. And at the very beginning, your son played a very important role. As any grassroots organization does. It's a handful of people trying to get a message out. And so do you want to take us through sort of how you came up with the name, of course, and then you want to take us right up to the rally on the levee and how all that happened. So let's talk about that.
I didn't want to be the leader of anything. I just wanted to help get the word out about what really happened to the people of New Orleans who were wearing this cloak of shame. So I spent a good week or two trying to find somebody else who was already trying to peddle this message, and I couldn't find anybody. And then I realized, well, I guess I'm just going to have to do it myself for a while. So my son, he's listening to me, which all I talked about with the levees and the levee failures. And my son, who's just barely 15, just turned 15, said, "Mom, if you will, write up a mission statement and that kind of stuff, I'll do the website for you." Keep in mind, we weren't living in New Orleans. We were hours away, and I couldn't have any face-to-face meetings with anybody. Everything had to be online. So that night, my son went to the internet and looked up the word levees. And at that time, you could have had levees.net, levees.org, levees.com. None of these things were taken yet. No one had ever heard of levees until the levees broke in New Orleans. By the way, 62% of the nation's population does live by levees, but no one really thinks about them. They certainly weren't before August 29, 2005. So my son created a website and I wrote a mission statement. And then I thought, well, we need a little bit more than that if we're going to change the narrative in the whole country about the flooding. I said, we need members. So I thought, well, how will I do that? And I penned a little petition. And the petition was to the President of the United States, asking him to please keep his promise that he had made in Jackson Square to build back the levees bigger and stronger. So we put the petition up on our website. We sent word of mouth. We just sent it off to all of our family and friends. And overnight, we had 200 signatures. And that's how it all started.
So that set you in motion to where we are today, basically. So that was the initial actions you took. And of course, you also, and by the way, we should put this in perspective time-wise. 8/29/2005 is Hurricane Katrina. We're talking about literally within 6 months, all the things we're talking about right now happened.
Oh, so, no, way less than that.
Yeah, 4 months probably.
The organization was formed on December 1st. So it was just 3 months later, right? September, October, November. And yes, and then our first rally on the levee was January 21st. So it was pretty quick, pretty quick.
So that's what I'm saying.
I think this was, again, my post-traumatic stress syndrome. You had to do, it had to be today, it has to be today, it has to be tomorrow. And my husband used to act like every day was my last, or tell me that I acted like every day was my last. But that sense of urgency, I realize now was critical.
Yeah, and so So that, like I said, a lot of things are happening very quickly. To characterize it, you sort of understood what this narrative that was not what you believed it should be. Blaming the victims, basically, I guess you could characterize it as. And so you set in motion the creation organization, and your first event was in January, and you specifically chose a site right on a levee. So for those folks who don't know what a levee is really can be of different types of material and different designs, but basically it's to hold back water from flooding, particular areas. Either, could be out in the farmland. There's levees out there for other purposes, but in the city of New Orleans, it really is what protects all the livable areas, we'll say, in the city, is these whole network of levees. I mean, it's, of course, something we'll talk about here in a little while, the number of breaches that occurred, but it's a very large system. So you actually had your first rally on top of one of those, didn't you?
Yes. Within stone's throw of the Army Corps of Engineers headquarters.
Right. So you understood that the Army Corps of Engineers was really a federal entity that, of course, is, as we know, is responsible for a lot of sort of the nation's infrastructure, I guess we could say, but includes levees as well. And they were the most obvious group that had direct relationship to what happened here. And again, it was your work to sort of dig down over a course of years to figure out what in fact was the true story. But that rally, the very first one, you had several people show up. You were, as we all are, with different kinds of grassroots organizations, you're always concerned about how many people show up, and you had a very good turnout that day. Yes.
Yeah, and, my husband thought nobody was going to come. And it actually was a very successful event. Yeah. I would, the guesstimate, with the way you can count as best you can, it was well over 300 people.
Oh, very good.
Which is pretty good for a city that had no people in it.
Right, and that's an important point to make here, is that no one's really living there at this point, right? I mean, this is people that came in that were from there but came back to support your organization. So that set you in motion. Those sort of things got you in motion. And your book really, again, before we started today, I think one of the interesting things about your book is that you don't leave any detail out here in terms of who you met with, who you talked to, who you wrote letters to. All those things are in here, and they're dated too. So you can follow this chronology of your work in not only creating levees, but what levees did in the succeeding years up till now. And again, for those of you who came in a little bit late, I mentioned to Sandy earlier, this is a very unusual book in the sense that it's written by a person who had really no relationship to civil engineering or anything before 8/29, 2005. And so you, as a person, you take us through your firsthand account of your experiences as you went through the succeeding years of, again, focusing on particularly the narrative of who actually was responsible for building the levees and who actually was responsible for what happened that day. I mean, that was very important to you, and it took a long time to sort of change that narrative to where it is now, where corrections have been issued and all sorts of other things. But I'm jumping ahead here a little bit. But I wanted to point out to the readers that this is a very unusual book. A lot of books for people that were involved in some major incident in our country, it could be an active shooter situation or whatever. Those books are also first-person accounts, but I think the thing that differentiates those from Sandy's is that Sandy's book is really an operator's manual to really putting together a grassroots organization and the kind of not only successes but shortcomings and unfortunate failures along the way to get things changed the way that Sandy would have liked them to happen. So it's a really good, for anyone who's listening to this, who is interested in a particular issue, this is a great read in terms of giving you someone else's experience, because I could tell you, as I said again earlier before we started, that my own experience with 9/11 and Sally Regenhard, that's Christian Regenhard's mom who's on this call right now, when I read this book, or in Sandy's book, it was like I was reliving some of the stuff that I lived through with Sally and 9/11, because a lot of the same kinds of things happened along the way in terms of getting these organizations created. So So again, let me continue on here because I'm gonna leave it at this, Sandy. Maybe you want to throw some more nuggets out there, but a bulk of the book is the years like 2006 up to, let's say, 2010, 11, where there's a lot of things going on back and forth. You go to Washington. How many trips do you ever calculate how many trips you made to Washington, Sandy?
Too many.
Too many. I mean,
Too
it was
many.
dozens.
Probably
certainly.
about 4 or 5.
Well, I think it was more than that, actually, when I read it. Seemed, because you had to travel a lot, right? Because
well,
you literally.
Washington, D.C. or Baton Rouge?
No, Washington. Yeah,
okay,
Washington.
Washington, D.C. My organization was, we did push for federal legislation.
Right.
Yes, you're right. It may have been more than 5 times.
I think you were there a lot because
Yeah.
because one of the things that you did in that sort of that time period, let's say again, after the organization is created, you get your first kickoff event, you spend every living day basically writing emails and letters and doing TV interviews and trying to sort of get to where you want to be, which really ultimately was an 829 investigation, right? I mean, we should talk about that a moment. So you realized pretty early on that you knew, from your perspective, you knew that this narrative was not correct, that there needed to be much deeper diving into what actually happened, particularly in the years before 2005, decisions that were made, who made them, those kind of things. The issues, of course, with the local levy board, which the Corps basically blamed for everything that happened. It was a local issue, and then that was another big thing that you dealt with.
And I just want to mention real quick that the Army Corps of Engineers was itself way too closely involved in the investigation, in the federal investigation. The Army Corps of Engineers was intimately involved with it, and they should have been completely, because due to conflict of interest, they shouldn't have been involved at all, which was one of the things we screamed about.
Right, and so, you know, there were inquiries going on to the levee failures. There were different inquiries going on. The one that you focus a lot on, of course, in your book is the one that was implemented or conducted by the ASC, the American Society of Civil Engineers, for the Corps of Engineers.
Right.
But you also, like maybe another level up, you realize that this was such a big issue that you felt even beyond just the investigation of how the levees failed themselves, there needed to be something higher up, and that's why you called for an 829 investigation, which was, I would imagine, was probably patterned something like the 9/11 Commission or something like that, which will look at the Challenger
investigation.
Or the Challenger, look at a broader set of issues than even just the technical aspects of the levee failures. It was going to look at the whole package, basically. Right. So you call for that, and you worked really hard to get it, and unfortunately, you got close, but it didn't happen, right? I mean, that's we never got there at the federal level, but other things did happen. So as you point out, you tell us there was a lot of controversy over, again, this sort of ally, in the sense that the ASCE was hired to do an inquiry of the Corps of Engineers, which they had a very close alliance with. Basically, they were very close organizations. One's, of course, a federal agency. One is a private nonprofit, but they work together all the time. And there's a lot of sort of overlap between the two. So you want to talk just briefly about the ASCE investigation? And there's a lot of players here, and that's what I'm saying. So we don't have to. Right.
Certainly. The Army Corps of Engineers was tasked to do an investigation of the levee breach event. And this was announced in October by Lieutenant General Carl Strock. And then, of course, immediately there were cries of conflict of interest from it was just me at that point, not that I could do much, but Steve Ellis with the Taxpayers for Common Sense in Washington, D.C. cried foul. Ivor Van Heerden cried foul. Other organizations, other people tried their hardest to speak up about that. And then the Army Corps of Engineers' response to this pushback was, well, it's going to be okay because we've got the American Society of Civil Engineers will peer review our study of the levee failures, except for one thing. The Army Corps of Engineers chose the trade group, picked who would do it, paid them directly, and gave them all medals of honor even before the investigation was complete. So these are the things we screamed about very, very loud, and we really did. That is something we did succeed in getting traction with, resulting in both an internal and an external investigation of the ASCE, which ended up, at the end of the day, no longer can you pay the ASCE directly if the ASCE is conducting an investigation, which I think is incredibly important and makes everyone in America better off just by that ruling.
Right. And so, you know, there was an internal inquiry into the ASCE's efforts, and then there was an external one. And I just point out to folks that the external one was actually conducted by Sherwood Bollard, who Sally Regenhard and I are very familiar with because he was the chairman of the House Science Committee that initiated a federal inquiry into the collapse of the World Trade Center. So he already had, by the time he came into that situation, he had already been very involved with 9/11. And so there was a connection there in the sense that he, like I said, he had dealt with the ASCE back then with 9/11 because they had actually conducted what's called a BPAT study of the collapse of the World Trade Center, and they were directly involved there as well. So I, you know, at the end of the day, this issue of conflict of interest was, of course, at the very center of things, and as a result of these internal and external inquiries into the actions of ASCE in relationship to the Accord, their policies were changed to sort of put a firewall between both the money and their relationships, basically. So that was a success story, really, I think, of
very much
your efforts. That's of your efforts. And so even though the 829 didn't happen, you did get positive change. I mean, and sometimes, again, I'm just sort of speaking from experience, sometimes you have to take a step back every once in a while and look at, even though you didn't get everything, you know, that you were hoping to do, there were successes along the way to sort of redirect things and sort of change things so that, you know, there was positives in the sense that going forward, some of these things hopefully shouldn't happen again, basically. So let me, I got some more questions for you because we're right about 10 after 2. So we're going to go another 10 or 15 minutes and then we'll do some Q&A. So based on your experience, Sandy, what things come to you immediately? What should you be aware of, like, after a disaster happens? So, you know, another disaster somewhere else, maybe not even Levees, but somewhere else. What are the things that you learned here that were important?
Okay, great question. The number one thing is that the early reports are almost assuredly wrong. The early things you hear about a disaster, you can almost take it to the bank that the reports are off base or wrong or exaggerated or completely false. So beware of the initial information that you hear. It's most likely wrong because of the chaotic environment, the chaos of the reporting environment. So that's number one. Number two, to beware jumping to conclusions. It is so easy for us as human beings to come to conclusions that jive with our worldview, jive with the way we understand things, and it's human. Beware of doing that. My favorite sociologist once said, beware talk of blaming catastrophe on water and wind, because human beings are assuredly hiding behind those words. And that's what inspired the title of my book. And then the third thing is crucially important, is disasters tends to be the instigator for new legislation, and that new legislation is often called reform legislation, when in fact, this new legislation, it often, maybe not always, but often was legislation that was all sitting, written, and ready to go, waiting for a disaster to happen. So if you ever see legislation being introduced mere weeks after a disaster, I would be pretty comfortable in saying I believe that legislation is being put forth for reasons not having to do with making the American people safer, but probably has something to do with making business people or some sort of stakeholder something that's beneficial to them. Not making a conclusion, but I'm saying look at that very carefully and make sure, is this really reform, or is it something in disguise?
Right, right. And I think to extend that thought further, one of the things personally I learned after 9/11 was, as time goes on, it gets more difficult to sort of get answers to these questions, in the sense that the public's attention moves away from these things. Of course, with 9/11, I mean, the New York City area, we still think about it a lot, but for the rest of the country, a lot of people have moved on already. And so it's something, when you're talking about disaster, it's important to say, as you point out, to avoid drawing conclusions and sort of, saying, okay, well, that's what happened, that's the end of it, close the door. It's really important to focus on putting an investigation into play that will actually have some period of time in which they're going to be able to dissect the incident and sort of pull out the important things, and of course make recommendations. Now, this is just one other point I want to make about it, is that we learned this with 9/11 as well, is that I think most of the people on the call today know, if there's ever a plane crash anywhere in America, there's at least one NTSB investigator goes there. When the Twin Towers collapsed, there is no entity like the NTSB for buildings. It didn't exist. And it was through efforts of Sally and other folks that we now have a law that created the National Construction Safety Team, which actually looks at building disasters. Well, here's another situation where, when the Levees breach, there is no federal agency that sort of handles broad brushly, a disaster, basically. And a few of us have called for that. It was Scott Knowles from Drexel University, and I co-authored an article a couple months ago. We really think the federal government should really think about some sort of a broader brush in terms of a disaster board, that when something like the Levees, New Orleans happens, or the Minneapolis I-35 bridge collapses, or whatever, any of these kind of major incidents that grab national attention, that there's a capability already ready to go that can sort of morph into what's specifically needed. And that's the problem, because without that, it's sort of Sandy Rosenthal having to push for an 829 investigation. And I'm sure she would agree with me, as time went on, it gets harder and harder and harder to get people to sort of buy it, because it's getting further and further away in the past, basically. So
human attention is infinite, is tiny, but and it goes away. But fortunately, a law called Request Under the Freedom of Information Act is forever, and you can always depend upon that law to get you the information that you need. I think it's a way underutilized and way under-exhausted right of the people of America that most are not aware of.
Right.
Very important.
Right. And so one of the things you point out in your book, by the way, one specific detail about the actual response in the immediate aftermath of the levee failures was the issue of Red October, right? So, which is really a technology component that never made it there, right? Never made it to New Orleans, right, Sandy?
Not until it was almost too late. Red October was a telecommunications complex on the back of a tractor trailer. It had 30 workstations, and FEMA could have wheeled that tractor trailer in, cranked up the cell tower, and I moved away from my mic, cranked up the cell tower, and poof, right away, there would have been a communications network for first responders and to be able to communicate with Washington, D.C. This is something that would have been worth literally life and death. Because of a miscommunication, two different people ordered the tractor trailer. The order got countermanded and canceled altogether and didn't get wheeled in to New Orleans until a week after the disaster. And by then, I don't even need to go into the horrible things that had happened in that week, due largely because of lack of communication, rumors spreading, people being afraid. And anyway, Red October, I think, is the single biggest, in my opinion, the single biggest failure of FEMA.
Right. And picking up on that point, here we are in the middle of a pandemic, COVID-19. And I think you see some parallels with what the work that you've been doing, right?
Very much so. Well, similarly to the levee breaches, I already talked about how I packed for 3 weeks and boarded my house to be there alone for a month. Well, fast forward to this past March, while most of New Orleans was at Mardi Gras watching parades like they should normally be doing, my husband and I were at Costco buying medicines, towel paper, toilet paper, and our favorite food to eat, because by looking at the numbers, we could see this virus was coming and might already be here. In fact, I was even a guest speaker at Tulane University on March 7th, and at Tulane, I actually said these things. It's probably here now. We shouldn't be touching each other. And I got given looks of either eye rolls or downright people thinking I was a whack job. This was March 7th. Well, anyhow, but what happened is, because then sure enough, a week later, everything hit and the store shelves all got emptied out 1 week later. But because of I had already got all the things I needed. We even bought an Airdyne in case we couldn't come out of our house like in Italy for a little while. So again, I'm in this relatively secure space where I could watch the disaster unfold. And again, just like 15 years ago, watch the response unfold. And just like 15 years ago, it's clear to me now that we have in front of us a failed response. Regarding 15 years ago, there is no dispute. It is uncontested that the federal response to the levee breach event was a failure in every way. Almost every way. And then here we are 15 later, there has been no calls for a congressional investigation, and there have been no calls for congressional hearings on the effectiveness of the response. But I'm pretty sure that when those hearings take place, and they will, that once again, we're going to be looking at a case where we had a failed federal response.
Yeah, and like I said, the unfortunate thing is we don't have really any independent sort of group to sort of again, to pull apart an incident and figure out what worked or what didn't work. And in this case with COVID, I mean, besides being an international issue, it's really within the United States. It really is, in my mind, not just a federal issue, but state and local. I mean, it shows the shortcomings, particularly of our emergency management system in the country. I mean, we have a good system, but it's strained, and there's pieces that don't work. Again, during this COVID, that's my take on things. We got, like I said, let's call for some questions. I got a couple more things to ask Sandy about, but in the meantime, any of you have questions for Sandy, please put them at the bottom part of your screen. You can click on the Q&A and you can type in your question. So let me just ask you a couple more things, Sandy, just sort of catch us up to date where you are right now. You and I were involved with sort of a legacy, I call it a legacy project for Levees.org, in terms of a tangible physical thing, and that is the flooded house museum relic that you have in New Orleans. And then talk about that and also your sort of work toward, nominating the breach sites. You picked two, and I mean, if you can give us a short version of those two things, the flooded house and this historic nomination thing, what you and I both were involved with. So tell us about.
I'm going to go ahead and give credit where credit is due, because it was Professor Corbett who picked up the phone and called me, I believe in 2011, and urged me to nominate one of more breach sites to the National Register of Historic Places, which made perfect sense because the levee breach event changed America as we know it. Any event that changes national policy is something worth having on the National Register. So it was Professor Corbett who urged me to do that, and we did it, and that's detailed in the book. But something more recent was another phone call, Professor Corbett, he's very convincing on the phone, And he called me, and he had seen, while he was visiting New Orleans, I'm not sure what year, I believe 2009, when there was a conference was held in New Orleans, sponsored by the college, John Jay College. And he had seen a vacant house right at the site of a levee breach. And he called me later and he said, that house, that little house with the hole in the roof, he said, you might consider preserving that house. And because years later, there'll be nothing to show our children's children, you know, what was it like? What was this event like? And this is a real house that was really flooded. It's really a stone's throw from a real breach site. And you can see the new levee where the levee was rebuilt. So for those of you out there that are familiar with historic preservation, the site had integrity coming out in spades. So, and I listened, and one thing I'll give my side. Okay.
Talk about your memorial garden too.
Okay.
I mentioned that you purchased the house. Go ahead.
So when did you lose me?
Right when you had just purchased the house. So, and you were thinking about as being a sort of a permanent, sort of tangible thing.
And so we did purchase the house, and we preserved it, and we took one of the front rooms and retrofitted it, so to speak, and recreated a scene of what a living room, a normal family's living room would have looked like when they came back. After it was flooded, and what people had to live with and accept and then rip out, quite heartbreaking, but very, very effective as well. So yes, that's what we did with the house, and it is there, and it's very popular site.
And you have the memorial garden next to it. You want to talk about that also?
Sure. And then right next to it, this is again on the advice of a neighbor. A neighbor picked up the phone and called me one day. I got a lot of phone calls. So she called me and said, did you know about a program in New Orleans called the house next door, the lot next door program? I said no. I live in an area that didn't flood. So she said, yes, there's a great program with the city, and there's a lot right here at the breach site of the London Avenue Canal. I said, you can lease these lots for, you're not going to believe this, $250 a year. That pays for the administration.
Right.
That's free, basically. And said right. For $250 a year, says you could take the site and maybe you could put up some signage explaining what happened. Well, we did a little bit more than put up some signs. We actually built a structure that houses a lot of information about the levee breaches, and it's also got a beautiful rain garden and native plants, and that's also a very, very popular destination for people. People arrive in New Orleans to this day, their feet hit the ground at the airport, and they want to understand the levee breach event, and they want to see information to help them with the breach event, and it's been very effective.
So it's both a memorial garden, it's also an educational facility in the sense that it educates people sort of in a relatively short series of panels, be able to explain what happened, basically. So it's a true memorial to the unfortunate people who were killed that day or those days, as well as what actually happened there. So
a symbol of resilience and a memory and a memorial to those we lost.
Right, and so anyone who's traveling to New Orleans, this is some place that you really need to go, and it's actually, Sandy will. Of course, your website's real easy. It's levees.org. That's all it is. So you can find the flooded house and the memorial garden on there on her website. And I think I'm seeing Charles coming on. So I think we've got some questions, Charles. Yes?
Yes, we've got some questions here. The first one, Sandy, is if you wanted us to remember and understand just one thing from your experience, what would that be?
One thing. Okay, believe in yourself. Believe in yourself, because if you've found something worth changing or found something worth fixing or found something worth exposing, you are going to get pushback. You might even get abuse and harassment. So it's critical that you believe in yourself. And the question, how do you get that belief in yourself is part spiritual and also part good old fashioned reading and writing and studying. Because if you're very, very knowledgeable about a subject, that helps you get that belief in yourself.
Okay, that was terrific, Sandy. I should put that on a loop and play it for all of our students. The next one, it's just, this one says, "Thank you for your activism and your book. It reads a lot like a thriller," which is true to the promotion. And I was wondering if you'd ever consider teaching a class on civic activism, or have you thought about that?
I most definitely have thought about it. If I write another book, it will be about more of a how-to, as a guidebook on how to fix a wrong and make it right. So yes, I would love to do something like that, and actually would be interested in teaching a course like that. Great idea.
Well, I'll leave it to you to follow up on that one. So the next question is, do you have any thoughts, or did you have anything about nursing or the nursing profession or nurses as it figures into the book, or just your experience in Katrina and recovering?
I have a wonderful book. It's right here in my library, Voices of Angels. The nursing profession and the doctors are the heroes, not the only heroes, but some of the amazing and probably unsung heroes, because many of them had to stay here when Hurricane Katrina's surge arrived, and had to suffer through and work through the disaster. And then many of them, families left, and then they had to continue to stay here for weeks and weeks and weeks. I was one of the lucky ones. I could sleep with my husband at night, but my husband wasn't a doctor or a nurse. But I don't think the general public realizes how many of the medical profession had to stay here after the breach event, and deal with, so many people that were still here right after the flooding. So they are heroes, and they deserve lots and lots of books to talk about the great work they did.
Okay, thank you. This next one, I think we maybe we'll put it out as a poll to the audience, but it says, "Sandy is the Aaron Brockovich of New Orleans." So Sandy, what actor should play you in the movie? And
Helen Mirren.
Oh, you got it already? It's Helen Mirren?
Helen Mirren.
Wow, that was fast. You're ready. You're ready with that one. Okay. All right.
I think big.
Okay. Well, that's our list of questions that we've got right now. So I'll keep them coming.
Yeah. So just, I think there's a couple more coming in now, Charles. Let me just, one of the things I think, again, we started this conversation off saying, you were a family that lived in New Orleans and sort of were focused on being prepared for hurricanes, which of course are, a common occurrence there. And that you were ready to sort of move, out of the city up to Baton Rouge to do your work. And you would never have thought that, 10 years later, or even longer, that that you would become sort of an expert in these issues of levee design and construction. And there are a lot of people along the way that sort of you work with, and they're all in the book, by the way, folks. Every one of the people that Sandy interacted with, that helped her along the way, and sort of she was influenced by. There's literally dozens of people in there. One person I should mention was J Bosworth, who came to you a few years into this, I guess, and became sort of a scout for you, I guess, a scout and a sort of a guide to the world of civil engineering. So, there's other folks as well, but I think he plays a critical role even for you today, because he's one of your board members, and he's sort of the technical side of Levees.org, and helped you. And I bring him up one reason, because the same thing happened, as you point out, with me, and that, one of the things that for us in 9/11 was the fact that Sally Regenhard, on 9/10 would never have thought her life would be forever changed, or what happened that day, and it's 9/11. And she never would have thought she'd end up in the world of building and fire codes and high-rise design and things like that. And I think one of the things, for me at least, our relationship to this day has been the fact that she had the moral authority to sort of open doors for us. And we were the technical people to advise her on what kind of things to ask about and to demand and to look into and things like that. And I think you, as you point out in the book, you had a similar experience with J Bosworth, because he was your guide to this world of civil engineering and levees, basically, and he's with you to this day as well. So do you want to just talk about him for a moment, or we've got to get a couple more questions coming in? So.
Yes. J Bosworth was encouraged to join forces with me by Professor Bob B. at the University of California, Berkeley. He had seen my work from afar, but he, as a civil engineer himself, obviously, he could see I needed help. And so upon his urging, J Bosworth contacted me, and we've been working together ever since. I mean, almost a day doesn't go by that we don't speak with each other on the phone or email each other. I could not have done the work of Levees.org without J Bosworth and his insights and what he taught me about civil engineering. And then whenever I was lost or I felt overwhelmed, he was standing there right by my side the entire way, and he still is. And the takeaway from this is if you want to lead an effort and make big changes, you are going to have to take advice and help from experts. And so, choose carefully, choose wisely, listen to your heart. And because it is these experts that you work with, often key to the success of whatever it is you want to do. And it's also important to sit back and let the expert, take that expert's advice, because they're probably right. If it's in their field, that they're probably absolutely right.
So it was really, and I picked him out specifically, but you had lots of other people on your team.
Mm-hmm.
To sort of make this happen, and that's,
mm-hmm.
but it was you who started it. This is Sally did. Sally started Skyscraper Safety just as you started Levees.org. So they were generated almost exactly the same way. So Charles, did I see another question or two come in?
We don't have any pending right now, Glenn.
Oh, okay.
A little more about Mr. Bosworth's background for people who may not have read the book.
Sure. He's a civil engineer. And he, before he began working with me with Levees.org, he worked for a couple of engineering companies, and the civil engineers don't work alone; they work in big companies. And so he had this company work at Lanier, I believe is the name of the company. I'm not sure it was before that. And now he works for himself now. He's a consulting engineer, and he's very, very well known in town. So everybody knows who J Bosworth is because of his work with Levees.org. So yes, in many ways, a lot of us have lives that are very, very different because of an event that happened, in our case, August 29, 2005. And he's definitely been, I call him definitely my right-hand man. And if there are situations where I couldn't do something or was ill or something, he could always step right in. And very, very valuable.
And how did you two meet?
How did we meet?
Yes.
Meet again. He was asked by Professor Bob B. at the University of California, Berkeley, to come help me. Professor Bob B. reached out to J directly. Okay.
So that, again, speaking to the importance of tapping into professional networks at the early stages.
Right.
At an early stage, that's a very good point. And I could go on and on. I had help from a political science, someone with a political science background. His name is Vince Pasquantonio. I had help from a media advisor. His name is Ken McCarthy. I had help from an attorney. His name is Mark Serprenant. I could go on and on. The list is long of experts that I've leaned upon to help with this, because I obviously I don't have all these expertises, obviously.
Well, that's, no, we appreciate that, because like I said, it's such an important thing, Sandy. What I'm doing right now is, I don't see any more questions. So let me give a plug to the book. Now, Sandy, you have a relationship with Octavia Books, correct? Mm-hmm. I was going to pull up Octavia Books on
and there is a link
in the world.
Okay. All right. Well, we've got another question in, Glenn. So go ahead.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Leave you on. Okay. I'll let you know if you drop off. So this next question is: the Army Corps of Engineers changed their method of attacking levee issues, or are they still, what's changed about that process today versus pre-Katrina?
After the levees broke during Hurricane Katrina, the Army Corps of Engineers changed the way it built levees. For example, the levees that broke, the worst breaches that flooded the main basin of the city, those breaches were something called eye walls, which is, as the name implies, it's steel sheet piling that looks like an eye driven into the ground. The Army Corps of Engineers no longer uses levees like that to protect people. Those levees should be used only for cows and crops, no offense to the cows. But those levees were not proper for people. In addition to that, the Army Corps of Engineers has changed the way it requires local levee districts in the entire country to do their maintenance. It used to be that the Army Corps of Engineers, it used to be the Army Corps required the local levee districts to do inspections once a year. Now it's 4 times a year. Also, inspections are more robust. They use geolocating equipment. They use iPads now. I mean, it's very, very uniform, more robust, and more frequent. And of course, all of these things combined together definitely make the American people safer, since, as I already pointed out, nearly 2/3 of the American population lives by levees.
That's a remarkable statistic, Sandy. And I remember, because I was teaching during Katrina at the college, and there were people, and there was a total narrative in the media, and some elected officials who basically said, you know, shame on the people of New Orleans because they live below sea level, and what do you expect that is going to happen to them? And of course, I pointed out to them at that time, you know, that New York City, much of New York City, particularly Lower Manhattan, is essentially very prone to flooding. And of course, we found that out amply after Hurricane Sandy, which caused devastating losses. And of course, had that logic been applied, you know, it would be a very different picture. And New York got an awful lot of money for recovery. And so, you know, the historic development of urban areas was traditionally tied to waterways. And so this notion that we're somehow going to divorce ourselves from flood risks is pretty naive.
Correct.
Okay, Glenn, you back?
Yeah, I'm back, but I'm not going to try to share that screen again because that's usually what. So go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
So Sandy, your book is available certainly through Amazon, but you have a special relationship with the Octavia Books, right? In
New Orleans.
In New Orleans on Octavia Street. What we can do, Charles, we can send out a link to that to the attendees today, so they can purchase the book through Octavia.
Appreciate it.
And so that's and again, if folks can also find it on other Barnes & Noble, I'm sure, and I know on Amazon it's there as well. So, but Octavia has a specific relationship with Sandy. They've, I guess, had several book signings, or at least one book signing there already. Because I think I remember you out in the street, right? That was in the COVID version of a book signing. It's actually on a table outdoors, basically, and people lined up in a socially distanced with masks on and stuff. So, exactly. So, Charles, any more questions, or is that we've run out of questions at this point?
We don't have any new questions yet, but maybe Sandy, talk about a little more some of the technical construction details on the levees in New Orleans and some of the cost saving, which I thought was pretty startling. Very early on in the book, you talked about, I guess, the depth of excavation or whatever they would do. So
yeah, so the cost saving that I believe you're referring to is that the Army Corps of Engineers in the 80s was behind schedule and costs were rising, and so they began to look for ways to save money. And there's nothing wrong with that. We all look for ways to save money. Unfortunately, the Army Corps of Engineers made a tragic mistake when they wrongly concluded from their study that they only needed to drive those eye walls I spoke about. They wrongly concluded they only need to drive them down into the ground 16 feet, that's 1/6, as opposed to 46 feet, 4/6. And that conclusion was a wrong conclusion. And when Hurricane Katrina's surge arrived, those eye walls fell over when water was still 3 or 4 feet from the tops of those walls. It was an egregious, shocking failure. It's my understanding that an Engineering 101 student could have caught that mistake had there been any sort of peer review at the local universities or any university. So that's the mistake that you're talking about. As far as changes that have been made to the levees since that event, One thing that I can give credit to the Army Corps for is they have addressed the most egregious mistakes, which is the eye wall mistake. They've done things to make sure that water no longer can get into the city. They stop the water before it gets here now with something called the Lakeborne Surge Barrier. I think it's $1 billion just for that one wall. The Army Corps of Engineers got $14 billion from Congress to build a better flood protection system. And the system is in every way better than the one that we had 15 years ago. I do have to point out, though, that you won't find one single expert who will agree that the flood protection system that was built after Katrina is the appropriate one for a metropolitan city of our size, complexity, amount of population, infrastructure. We should have gotten something called 250-year or 500-year protection. The administration at that time said we shall have 1-year protection, which is the same as most, residential neighborhoods have. So why that was done was a political decision. It wasn't an economic one. But nonetheless, the system that we have in place today is head and shoulders better than the one we had 15 years ago.
Okay. Well, this is one thing I forgot to ask you earlier, Sandy. Mm-hmm. For as long as I've known you, you've always worked toward sort of the way you expressed it was really interesting. Katrina shorthand. Mm-hmm. So basically, sort of just always assuming that something else was actually true when in fact it was the shorthand issue. So you took a lot of organizations, and of course, including the Corps and mm-hmm. civil engineers and folks, but also media as well, right? So you just want to talk briefly about shorthand in the media.
Certainly. Around 2008, 2009, my organization launched a campaign called Stop Katrina Shorthand. And what Katrina shorthand is, it is a short, lazy, and wrong characterization of the storm. It basically it's saying we repelled the use of saying Katrina flooded New Orleans because it mischaracterized the flooding. It made it sound like a storm flooded the city rather than civil engineering failure. So it's short, it's easy, but it's wrong. And so we mounted this campaign, Stop Katrina Shorthand. We had bumper stickers, and we used that term a lot. We've kind of retired it, but we continue to call out any news media that uses that lazy terminology in their reporting. Fortunately, major media has stopped. Major media meaning the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, major media, they have stopped because of our continual knocking on their door, letting them know you shouldn't use that.
Right. So that was, I want to bring that up because, most of, obviously, or not most, but a lot of your book, of course, deals with the organizations involved with the levee design and construction and their affiliates and things, but the media is a big part of your book as well. And mm-hmm. It was important to do that because you're able to successfully sort of get it to the point now where, as you say, the national media really doesn't sort of use shorthand basically and just imply that it was, everybody died because the storm killed them basically. And you want to, of course, emphasize the fact that this was an engineering failure. Not the storm itself. So, like I said, there's a lot more in Sandy's book that we haven't talked about today. You can term it a page turner. It is that. And again, it's chock full of detail, much more than you would ever expect. Someone who with no background in engineering to have this level of detail of understanding and also advocacy certainly in their book. So Charles, I think we're there, right? I don't see any more questions. So I think we're at the end. Sandy's actually dealing with Hurricane Delta right now. We can't quite hear through your windows, but she hears it there in New Orleans. So Charles, you have anything else to say or? at this point?
No, just we wish you well, Sandy. We will circulate the link as well as a link to the, when we have this posted as a video, to all the registrants.
Appreciate it.
So, we'll keep an eye on you and we'll check in.
Yeah, thank you for inviting my comment today.
And then
Yes,
Glenn will talk to you about an exclusive teaching contract offline.
We could do that.
I look forward to it.
Very lucrative CUNY pay grade for adjunct faculty.
Yeah,
Well,
sure.
I don't think she's doing it for the money. I think she's going to do it for advocacy
You
purposes.
can ask my
So-
husband that. He said,
Okay.
Okay.
Well, again,
Thank
Sandy,
you all.
Hold on here,
Thank
we
you
got
so
one last
much.
question.
And,
Namaste.
Oh, it was a thank you for someone who survived Hurricane Betsy in 1965. Thanking you for all you did for New Orleans in improving their flood protection.
Thank you.
Okay.